5:17 in the morning. The only light in the kitchen came from my laptop screen, a cold blue rectangle in the dark. The rest of the house was silent. My son Kevin was asleep upstairs. His wife Lorraine was asleep. My two grandchildren were asleep. No one knew I had been awake since 4 o'clock. I scrolled down to row 412 on the spreadsheet. There it was, another payment, $7,500 wired to Strategic Consulting, LLC. The cursor blinked at me. Strategic Consulting, LLC did not exist. I knew this because I had checked the Pennsylvania Business Registry 5 years ago, the first time this vendor appeared on the books. There was no website, no phone number, and no tax ID on file. It was a ghost, a shell, a personal piggy bank for my daughter-in-law. I reached for my coffee, but it had gone cold. My hand didn't shake. I had spent 30 years as the chief accountant for Fitzgerald Corp., one of the largest logistics firms on the East Coast. I had led teams that uncovered embezzlement schemes 10 times more complex than this. Lorraine was not a criminal mastermind. She was sloppy. She left digital fingerprints everywhere because she was arrogant enough to believe no one was looking. She was right. Kevin never looked, but I did. I plugged my flash drive into the USB port. The little chime sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. Copy, paste, save. 1 copy on the company cloud server, 1 copy on my personal drive. The file transfer bar filled up green. Done. I pulled the drive out and slipped it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt right over my heart. That was the routine. Every month for 6 years. I tracked every dollar she stole. I categorized it. Then I adjusted the other accounts, inflating the logistics costs by 0.3% here, padding the spoilage write-offs there to make the books balance. If I didn't do this, the company would show a massive deficit. The bank would call the loan. Kevin would lose the business. My grandchildren would lose their home. So I became her accomplice. $573,840. That was the running total as of this morning. I did not need a calculator to know that number. It was carved into my brain right next to the date my wife Diane died. "You are too loyal, Howard," Diane used to tell me. "One day it is going to kill you." I closed the laptop just as the floorboards creaked overhead. The house was waking up. I sat there in the dim light, a 71-year-old man in a faded bathrobe waiting for the people I was protecting to come downstairs and treat me like furniture. 7:30. The kitchen was chaos, smelling of burnt toast and expensive coffee. Kevin was trying to tie his tie while looking at his phone. Lorraine was packing lunches with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. My granddaughter Lily sat across from me, kicking her legs under the table. "Grandpa," Lily said, her spoon hovering over her cereal, "why are you up so early?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Lorraine cut in before I could make a sound. "Grandpa just watches TV, honey," she said. She didn't look at me. She was busy wiping a spot off the counter. "Old people wake up early. They don't have anything else to do." I picked up my coffee mug. It was empty, but I held it anyway. In Lorraine's world, I was the help. Free labor. To her, I was a data entry clerk. She thought I spent my days typing receipts into QuickBooks because I was bored. She had no idea that I held a certified fraud examiner license that was still active. She didn't know that the upgrades she demanded for the inventory system were actually masking her own theft, and that I was the one writing the code patches to keep the software from flagging her transactions. I let her believe I was useless. It was safer that way. "Kevin," Lorraine snapped, turning to my son, "did you prepare for the vendor meeting at 9? Do not tell me you are going in there with the old slide deck." Kevin flinched. He looked 45, but in moments like this, he seemed 12. I was going to look at it on the train," he mumbled. "Give it to me," she said, holding out her hand. "You always mess up the margins, and check the projections again. You are terrible at math." Kevin handed over his phone without a fight. He was a good man, my son. He had a heart the size of a barn, but he hated conflict. He would set himself on fire if it kept Lorraine warm. I watched her swipe through his presentation, her manicured thumb moving aggressively against the screen. "Mom," Lily said, "Grandpa is good at math. He helps me with my homework." Lorraine let out a short, sharp breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "That is third-grade arithmetic, Lily. Business is different. It is about analysis, strategy. Grandpa just types numbers. He doesn't understand the big picture." She looked at me then. A quick, dismissive glance. There was no malice in it, which somehow made it worse. It was just a pity. She truly believed I was too simple to understand the business she was slowly bleeding dry, value versus visibility. Diane's voice echoed in my head again. The most important work is the work no one sees. I wanted to slam my hand on the table. I wanted to tell her that without my typing, the IRS would have audited them 3 years ago. I wanted to tell her that I knew about the crypto account she was trying to refill with company funds. But I looked at Kevin. He was staring at his shoes, looking defeated before the day had even started. If I spoke, I would destroy him. So I took a sip from my empty mug and said nothing. By 3 o'clock, the house was quiet again. The silence in the suburbs was heavy, different from the silence in the city. It felt thick like wool. I was in the backyard raking leaves that didn't really need raking when my grandson ran out the back door. Jake was 8 with messy hair and knees that were perpetually grass-stained. "Grandpa." He skidded to a halt in the grass, clutching a crumpled worksheet. "I don't get it." I leaned the rake against the old oak tree. "Don't get what, buddy?" "Fractions," he said, making the word sound like a disease. Mom tried to explain it last night, but she got mad when I didn't understand. She says I'm not focusing. I wiped my hands on my jeans and sat down on the patio steps. "Come here, let me see." He sat next to me, his small shoulder pressing against my arm. I looked at the paper. It was a mess of eraser marks and circled numbers. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Forget the numbers for a second. Think about a pizza." "Pepperoni." "Sure, pepperoni. If you have one pizza and you want to share it with me, Kevin and Lily, how many slices do we need?" "4," he said instantly. "Right. So one pizza, 4 people. That means each piece is 1 part of 4, 1/4. I drew a circle on the back of the paper with his pencil. "Now, what happens if Kevin is really hungry and eats 2 slices? Jake giggled. "Dad eats a lot." "He does. So if he eats 2 slices, is that half the pizza?" Jake stared at the drawing. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. The moment when confusion clears and understanding breaks through it is the best feeling in the world. Better than balancing a ledger, better than finding a missing penny. "Yeah," Jake whispered. 2 slices is the same as half." "Exactly. 2/4 is the same as 1/2. You just reduce the fraction." He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "That's it. That's all it is." "That is all it is. Numbers are just a language, Jake. You just have to learn how to speak it." He grinned, a gap-toothed smile that broke my heart. "You're smart, Grandpa. Mom said you weren't." The air left my lungs. "She did." Jake shrugged, already turning back to his paper, innocent of the wound he had just inflicted. "She told Dad that we need a professional tutor because you confuse me, but you don't. You make it easy." I sat there on the cold concrete steps, listening to the scratch of his pencil. The wind picked up, rattling the dry leaves across the lawn. A professional. That was the word she used. The back door slid open. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Jake," Lorraine called out. Her voice wasn't yelling, but it carried that edge of command that made everyone in this house jump. "Inside, now. Your tutor is here." Jake's face fell. "But Grandpa helped me. I get it now." "We are not doing this again," Lorraine said, stepping onto the patio. She was wearing her work suit, sharp and gray. She looked at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered into the yard. "Thank you for trying, Howard, but Mr. Henderson is a certified educator. We need to make sure Jake learns the proper methods." "Proper methods." "He understands the concept, Lorraine," I said quietly. "He needs to pass the standardized test, Howard, not learn pizza analogies." She put a hand on Jake's shoulder and steered him toward the door. "Go, now!" Jake looked back at me, one last desperate glance before disappearing into the kitchen. Lorraine stayed behind for a moment. She looked at the rake leaning against the tree, then at me. "By the way," she said, checking her watch, "we need to talk tonight. Family meeting. Have dinner ready by 6. She turned and walked inside, sliding the glass door shut. The lock clicked. I sat there alone in the yard. My hand went to my chest pocket, feeling the hard plastic of the USB drive through the fabric. She wanted a professional. She had no idea she was living with one. And tonight, I had a feeling the bill was finally coming due. The next morning, I drove to the industrial park on the edge of town. I told myself I was going to drop off the monthly bank reconciliations, but that was a lie. The files were already on the server. I was going because I needed to see the battlefield. Lorraine's comment about a professional had kept me awake for the second night in a row. The office of Web Food Distribution was a single-story brick building sandwiched between a tire depot and a carpet warehouse. I parked my 10-year-old sedan next to Kevin's SUV. There was a new car in the visitor spot, a German convertible silver shining aggressively under the Pennsylvania sun. I walked in with my manila envelope. The receptionist, Sarah, gave me a tight smile. She looked nervous. "Howard," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "they are in the conference room." "Who is they?" "Lorraine, and a consultant." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. I walked past her desk down the short hallway that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I saw them. Lorraine was standing at the whiteboard, a red marker in her hand. Sitting at the table was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine advertisement for expensive watches. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked back hair and a suit that cost more than my car. I opened the door. Lorraine froze. Her eyes snapped to me, then to the envelope in my hand. For a second, I saw panic. Then the mask slid back into place. "Howard," she said. Her voice was too loud for the small room. "We were just brainstorming." The young man stood up and offered a hand that was smoother than mine had been since 1975. "Justin Daniels," he said. "Synergy Solutions." "Howard Webb," I said. I didn't shake his hand. I placed the envelope on the table. I brought the reconciliations. "Oh, right," Justin said, glancing at the envelope with a faint smirk. "Paper copies, old school. I love it. Very retro." Lorraine stepped between us, acting as a physical shield. "Mr. Daniels is here to help us modernize Dad. He specializes in cloud-based integration and AI-driven forecasting." "We are moving everything to the cloud," Justin added, tapping his iPad. "Real-time analytics, total transparency, no more manual entry errors, no more opacity. Total transparency." I looked at Lorraine. She was watching me, her jaw set tight. She didn't know. She truly didn't know that opacity was the only thing keeping her out of federal prison. The legacy system she hated, the one I maintained, was the only reason her theft hadn't triggered automatic flags at the bank. If this boy hooked his AI-driven tools into the raw data, he would see the hole in the accounts within 48 hours. "Transparency is good," I said slowly, holding her gaze, "but you have to be careful what you expose, Lorraine. Sometimes the old systems are there for a reason." "The old systems are obsolete, Howard," she snapped. She turned back to Justin, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "My father-in-law helps us with the data entry. You know how it is. We try to find things for him to do." "Data entry." Justin nodded sympathetically, as if we were discussing a toddler who liked to draw on the walls. "It is great to keep the seniors active," he said. "My grandmother knits." I stood there for a moment. I could have ended it right there. I could have pulled the flash drive from my pocket and walked Justin through the phantom vendor payments. I could have explained forensic accounting to this child who probably thought a ledger was a type of haircut. But I saw Kevin's office door open in the background. My son stood there looking pale and tired, rubbing his temples. If I burned her down, he burned with her. "Good luck with the modernization," I said. I walked out. I left the envelope on the table. It contained the evidence that balanced her checkbook, but she would probably shred it. She is a professional now. The execution happened the next morning, 9:30. The house was quiet after the grandkids had left for school. I was in the kitchen rinsing my coffee mug when Lorraine walked in. Kevin followed her, trailing a few steps behind like a man walking to the gallows. "Sit down, Dad," Lorraine said. It wasn't a request. I sat at the small round table. Lorraine remained standing. She preferred the height advantage. Kevin pulled out a chair but didn't sit. He just leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, studying the pattern of the floor tiles. "We have made a decision," Lorraine began. She had her hands clasped in front of her, rehearsed and ready. "The company is at a critical juncture. Mr. Daniels has shown us that we are bleeding efficiently. We need to trim the fat." "I work for free, Lorraine," I said. "You cannot trim zero." She didn't blink. "It is not about the cost of labor. It is about the cost of mistakes, the cost of outdated thinking. We need a professional accounting firm, people who understand the modern market. We need analysis, Howard. Strategy, not just someone who can type numbers into a spreadsheet." I looked at Kevin. "Is that what you think I do? Just type numbers?" Kevin shifted his weight. "Dad, look!" Lorraine thinks that... I think... Lorraine interrupted, her voice sharpening, that you are a nice man, Howard. But let us be honest. You are an old man. You sit in that room all day, you watch your shows, you peck at the keyboard. It is busy work. We created it to make you feel useful, but we can't afford charity anymore. The word hung in the air. Charity. 15 years. 9 years advising them on tax structures while I was still chief accountant at a Fortune 500 company. 6 years keeping their ship afloat after I retired. $580,000 of theft masked by my own hand. And she called it charity. So I am fired, Banta, I said. We are restructuring, she corrected, and that brings us to the second matter. She took a breath. This was the part she actually enjoyed. I could see it in the slight lift of her chin. Kevin and I have been looking at our household expenses, the inflation, the tuition for the kids. It adds up. We have a 3,000 square foot house and we are not utilizing our assets. My room, I said. It is a suite, really, she said. Separate entrance, private bath. I checked the comps in the neighborhood. We could get $1,500 a month for it, easily. I looked at my son. You want to rent out my room? Kevin finally looked up. His eyes were wet, red-rimmed. Dad, money is tight. The business is... We are struggling with cash flow. Lorraine says, I say we need to be practical. Lorraine cut in. You have your pension. You have the house in Lancaster. It is just sitting there empty. It makes no sense for you to be here taking up space that could be generating revenue. Taking up space? I repeated. You know what I mean, she said, checking her watch. Look, this is not personal. It is just economics. You are, well, frankly, Dad, you are a useless old man here. You have no friends in the neighborhood. You have no hobbies. You are just waiting to die and you are dragging us down while you do it. Silence. The refrigerator hummed. A car drove past outside. I waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds. I was waiting for Kevin. I was waiting for him to say no, to say, he is my father, to say, he raised me. Kevin looked at his wife. Then he looked at me. Then he looked back at the floor. I'm sorry, Dad, he whispered. That was it. The verdict. I stood up. My knees popped a sound like a dry branch snapping. I felt strangely light, as if a heavy coat had been lifted from my shoulders. I understand, I said. My voice was steady. It surprised me. You have made your position very clear. Lorraine blinked. She had expected a fight. She had expected begging. She didn't know what to do with dignity. Good, she said, smoothing her skirt. We would like to list the room by the 1st of the month, so if you could be out in 3 days, I will be gone tomorrow, I said. I walked past them. I didn't look at Kevin. I couldn't. If I looked at him, I would see the boy I used to carry on my shoulders and I would break. 11 o'clock that night. My room was a landscape of cardboard boxes. I had lived here for 6 years, but my life fit into 5 boxes, 4 for clothes and books, 1 for Diane. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the laptop open on my knees. The blue light was my only company. I opened my email archive. I searched for Diane. Thousands of results, grocery lists, reminders to pick up dry cleaning, photos of sunsets. I scrolled back to the end, 3 weeks before the heart attack that took her. Subject worried. Howard, I saw the way Lorraine looked at you at dinner tonight, when you corrected her about the wine vintage. Her eyes go cold, Howard, like a shark. I do not trust her. I know you love Kevin and I know you want to help them, but you have to be careful. Protecting Kevin does not mean sacrificing yourself. You have value. You are brilliant and kind and you have so much to give. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise, not even your son. Love always, D. I read it twice, then I read it again. She had seen it. 5 years ago she had seen the shark in the water while I was still trying to teach it to swim. A soft knock on the door pulled me from the screen. The handle turned and Jake slipped inside. He was wearing his dinosaur pajamas. He looked small in the half-light. Grandpa, he whispered, are you really leaving? I closed the laptop. Yes, Jake. I'm going back to Lancaster, to the old house. Why? He took a step closer, clutching a stuffed bear I had bought him when he was born. Did you do something bad? No, I said. I didn't do anything bad. Then why is Mom making you go? Because. I struggled for the words. How do you explain greed to an 8-year-old? How do you explain that his father was a man made of straw? Because adults are complicated, Jake. Sometimes They think things are broken when they are actually just fine, and sometimes they throw away things they think they don't need. He climbed onto the bed and sat next to me. He smelled like mint toothpaste and innocence. "I need you," he said. My throat tightened. I put my arm around his thin shoulders and pulled him close. "And I need you, buddy, but I have to go. It is for the best." "Will you come back?" "I don't know." He buried his face in my flannel shirt. I held him until he stopped shaking. "You have to promise me something," I said, tilting his chin up. "Keep doing your math, even if the tutor makes it boring. Numbers tell the truth, Jake. People lie, but numbers never do. You remember that?" "I remember," he sniffled. "Go to bed now, before your mom wakes up." He hugged me one last time, tight and desperate, then slipped out the door. I was alone again. I looked at the USB drive sitting on the nightstand. The evidence. The truth. I reached into my bag and pulled out a notepad and a pen. My hand hovered over the paper. I wrote the date. "Dear Kevin, if you are reading this, something has happened. There are things you do not know. Things I kept from you because I thought I was saving you. I was wrong. I wrote for 20 minutes. I explained the shell company. I explained forensic accounting. I explained exactly how much his wife had stolen from him down to the cent. I folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. On the front, I wrote, 'To Kevin. Open only in case of emergency.' I didn't leave it on the pillow. I didn't leave it on the desk. I opened the box labeled Diane's Things, tucked the letter inside an old photo album, and taped the box shut. I would take the secret with me. For now. I turned off the lamp. Tomorrow I would leave. In 6 weeks the auditors would arrive, and without me there to weave the lies into the ledger, the truth was going to tear them apart. The Greyhound bus smelled of diesel and damp wool. I sat 3 rows from the back, pressing my forehead against the cold glass as the Philadelphia skyline dissolved into the gray sprawl of the suburbs, and then eventually into the rolling farmland of Lancaster County. 2 hours. That was the distance between the life I had built and the life I had left behind. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't look at it. I knew it was Kevin. He had called 4 times since I walked out the door that morning. I let it buzz against my thigh until it stopped, a rhythmic reminder of the cord I had finally cut. As the miles ticked by, the vibration in the floorboards traveled up my legs, settling in my chest. It gave me too much time to think, to ask the question that had been haunting me since I packed my first box. Why did I stay for 15 years? It was not just habit. It was not just fear of being alone. I closed my eyes and did the math. I always did the math. 15 years total. The first 9 years, while I was still the chief accountant at Fitzgerald Corp., I was just an advisor. I would drive over on Sundays, review their quarterly taxes, and help Kevin structure his loans. I was the father helping his son build a kite. Then I retired 6 years ago. Diane died a year later. The house was too quiet and the silence was too loud. You should help Kevin more. Diane had told me, he needs you, and you need to be needed. So I became their full-time accountant, unpaid, unappreciated. And 1 year into that arrangement, I found the first transfer to Strategic Consulting LLC. Why did I stay then? Why did I not walk away 5 years ago when the theft began? I told myself it was for Kevin. I told myself I was protecting him from the heartbreak of knowing his wife was a criminal. But as the bus passed a horse-drawn buggy on the shoulder of the highway, a darker truth settled over me. I stayed because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I forced him to choose between his wife and his father, he would not choose me. I gripped the handle of my bag. I had spent 5 years cooking the books to keep a family together that was already broken. I had used 30 years of professional expertise to hide a crime, all so I could stay in a house where I was treated like furniture. But I was not there anymore. And in 6 weeks, the auditors from Ernst & Young would arrive at the office. A strange sensation washed over me, something I had not felt in a decade. It felt like the moment the roller coaster crests the hill right before the drop. I did not have to report Lorraine. I did not have to call the police. I did not have to do a single thing. I just had to be absent. The bus hissed to a halt in downtown Lancaster. I stepped off onto the pavement, the air crisp and smelling of manure and rain. It was the smell of my childhood. I caught a cab to the edge of town, to the small bungalow I had grown up in. I had kept it after my parents passed, paying the property taxes every year, telling myself it was an investment. Really, it was an escape hatch I never thought I would use. The taxi dropped me at the curb. I stood there, my 2 suitcases on the cracked sidewalk, looking at the house. It looked like a skull. The windows were dark and hollow. The white paint was peeling in long sunburned strips. The porch sagged on the left side, and the yard was a jungle of knee-high weeds and dead thistles. I walked up the driveway dragging my suitcase. A loose shutter banged against the siding in the wind. This was it. This was my reward for a lifetime of loyalty. A cold, empty house with no electricity and a roof that probably leaked. Howard Webb. The voice was gravel and smoke. I turned around. A man was standing on the other side of the waist-high chain-link fence. He was wearing grease-stained coveralls and an eagle's cap pulled low over gray hair. He was holding a wrench like a scepter. I squinted. The face was wider, the lines deeper, but the eyes were the same sharp blue I remembered from high school. "Ben," I said. "Ben Kowalski." He grinned, revealing a gold crown on his eye tooth. "I heard a rumor that you were coming back. Small towns talk faster than the internet." 40 years, I said, shaking my head. "You're still living next door." "Born here, gonna die here," Ben said. He opened the gate, the hinges screaming in protest. He walked over and looked me up and down. He didn't offer a hug, which I appreciated. He just studied me like a mechanic looking at a car with a blown gasket. "You look like hell, Howard." "Thank you," I said. "You look like you rolled in oil." He laughed, a bark of a sound. "Come on, you cannot stay there. The power has been off since the Clinton administration, and I saw a raccoon family move into the chimney last fall." I looked back at the dark, rotting house. Then I looked at Ben. "I don't want to impose," I said. It was the automatic, polite response, the reflex of a man used to being a burden. "Shut up," Ben said. "My wife passed away 2 years ago. The house is too big, and I made a pot of chili that could feed an army. You are staying with me." He grabbed my heaviest suitcase before I could protest and started marching toward his house across the street. It was a neat yellow rancher with a well-kept lawn and a detached garage that hummed with life. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, suspended between the ruin of my past and the unexpected warmth of the present. Then I picked up the other bag and followed him. 2 hours later, we were sitting in Ben's garage. He called it his shop, but it was really a sanctuary. Tools hung on pegboards in perfect order. A vintage Mustang sat on the lift, half restored. A space heater hummed in the corner, fighting off the Pennsylvania chill. We sat on mismatched stools. A pepperoni pizza box open on the workbench between us. Ben handed me a beer. It was cheap, cold, and tasted like heaven. "Okay," Ben said, wiping pizza sauce from his lip. "Spill it." "I told you," I said, picking at the label on the bottle. "My son and his wife decided they needed the space. They are renting out my room." Ben snorted. "Bull. You have the face of a man who just found a knife in his back. I have known you since we were 12, Howard. You were the guy who planned his homework schedule 2 weeks in advance. You do not just show up in Lancaster with 2 suitcases because of a rental dispute." I took a long drink. The alcohol hit my empty stomach hard. "My daughter-in-law fired me," I said, "from what's sitting on the couch. I was their accountant. I managed their books." Ben paused his beer halfway to his mouth. "Wait, you were the chief accountant for Fitzgerald Corp for 30 years. You handled mergers worth millions, and you were doing books for a food distribution company." "Yes." "Did they pay you?" I looked at the oil stain on the concrete floor. "No." Ben set his beer down with a sharp clink. "Okay, let me get this straight. You worked for free. You lived in their house, and they kicked you out. Lorraine calls me a data entry clerk." I said, the bitterness rising in my throat like bile. "She thinks I just type numbers. She told me I do not understand business strategy. She replaced me with a consultant who wears loafers without socks." Ben stared at me. He was a type 8 on the Enneagram, though he would probably punch me if I used that term. He dealt in hard truths and direct action. "Howard," he said slowly, "why do you look like you are holding a grenade?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. I hadn't spoken the truth aloud in 5 years, not to Diane's grave, not to myself. "Because she is stealing from the company," I said. The silence in the garage was absolute. The space heater clicked. "She has set up a shell company," I continued, my voice steady. Strategic Consulting LLC. She has been siphoning funds for 5 years, $580,000. She lost money in crypto, panicked, and tried to gamble her way back to zero. She failed. Ben leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. And you know this because I hid it, Ben blinked. You what? I hid it, I said. I adjusted the inventory costs. I smoothed the quarterly reports. I made the losses look like market fluctuations. If I hadn't, the bank would have pulled their line of credit years ago. Kevin would have lost the business. Does Kevin know? No. So let me understand. Ben said, his voice dropping an octave. You found out your daughter-in-law was robbing your son blind. And instead of telling him, you became her accomplice for 5 years. I protected him, I snapped. If I told him, it would destroy him. He worships her. It would break the family. So you broke yourself instead. Ben shook his head. That is not protection, Howard. That is control. You decided what he could handle. You kept him in the dark to keep the peace. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain about duty and sacrifice, but the words stuck in my throat because Ben was looking at me with pity, not admiration. So what happens now? Ben asked. You have the evidence. I tapped my chest pocket. Everything. 5 years of records. Are you going to the police? No. Are you going to tell Kevin? No. Then what is the plan? You just live in my guest room and wait for the world to end. I took another sip of beer. The annual audit is in 6 weeks. Lorraine fired the only person who knows how to hide the bodies. She thinks she hired a professional to replace me. She has no idea she just hired her own executioner. Ben stared at me for a long time. Then he leaned back and let out a low whistle. You are just going to let it happen, he said. You are going to let her walk into a buzzsaw. I'm just the data entry clerk, I said softly. What do I know about business, Howard? Ben said, a mixture of horror and respect on his face. That is the most passive-aggressive revenge I've ever heard. It is cold. I kind of like it. My phone buzzed on the workbench between us. The screen lit up. Kevin calling. Ben looked at the phone. Then he looked at me. Are you going to answer that? I looked at the name on the screen. I thought about Kevin standing in the kitchen staring at his shoes while his wife threw me out. I thought about 5 years of silence. I thought about the bus ride. No, I said. I reached out and pressed the side button. The screen went black. The ringing stopped. For the first time in 15 years, my son was on his own. My hands blistered on the 2nd day. By the 4th day, they had calloused over. For the first week in Lancaster, my life shrank down to the size of a toolbox. Ben and I attacked the old bungalow with the kind of ferocity usually reserved for enemies. We ripped up the rot-softened floorboards in the kitchen. We scraped layers of lead paint off the siding until our shoulders burned. We hauled 20 bags of trash to the dump in Ben's pickup truck, the bed rattling with the ghosts of my childhood accumulation. It was grueling, mindless work, and it was the happiest I had been in 6 years. There is a purity to physical labor that accounting lacks. When you fix a leaky faucet, the water stops dripping. The result is tangible, immediate. In my old life in the house in Philadelphia, I spent my days moving invisible money around digital columns to hide a crime that never stopped happening. I was a janitor for a mess that kept getting bigger. Here I was building something. On Tuesday, Ben tried to fix the plumbing under the bathroom sink. I sat on the edge of the tub handing him wrenches while he cursed at a rusted U-bend. You do not know what you are doing, I said. I know exactly what I'm doing. Ben grunted from beneath the porcelain. I'm using percussive maintenance. He hit the pipe with a hammer. A jet of cold water shot out, soaking his gray coveralls. We sat on the tile floor, dripping wet, laughing until our ribs ached. It was a rusty sound, my laughter. It felt foreign in my throat. That night, after Ben went home across the street, I sat at the small kitchen table we had salvaged from a yard sale. The house smelled of sawdust and fresh primer. It was quiet, but not the heavy, suffocating silence of Kevin's house. This was a peaceful silence. I opened the file box I'd brought from the city. I spread the papers out on the cheap laminate table. 5 years of bank statements, canceled checks, invoices from Strategic Consulting LLC that corresponded to absolutely no work done. I organized them chronologically. I highlighted the dates. I cross-referenced the amounts with the crypto market crashes of 22 and 23. I was not preparing a defense. I was not preparing an accusation. I was just putting the numbers in order because that is what I did. I balanced the books. For 5 years, I had carried the weight of these lies in my head. Now, laying them out on the table, I realized I was finally putting them down. The numbers were the story of my son's marriage, and for the first time, I was reading it from the outside. We were in Ben's garage 3 nights later when he finally pushed past the polite surface of our reunion. He was working on the transmission of his Mustang. I was sweeping the floor, the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom filling the space between the classic rock playing on the radio. So Ben said, not looking up from the engine block, "You look lighter." "I feel lighter," I said. "That is dangerous," he said. I stopped sweeping. "Dangerous how?" "Because you think you are done," Ben said. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and turned to face me. "You think because you walked out of that house the movie is over. You are sweeping my floor and fixing your roof and pretending that you did not leave a time bomb ticking in Philadelphia." "It is not my bomb, Ben. I did not build it." "No, you just hid the fuse for 5 years," he said. He walked over to the mini fridge and tossed me a soda. He leaned against the workbench, his expression serious. "Howard, look at me. You are smart, you are loyal, but you are lying to yourself if you think this is peace. This isn't peace. This is hiding." I cracked the soda open. The fizz hissed in the garage. "I'm not hiding," I said defensively. "I was fired. I left." "You ran," Ben corrected. "And listen, I get it. If my kid married a shark, I might run too. But you have to stop pretending you are innocent. You enabled her. Every time you fixed a ledger, you told her it was okay to steal. You taught her that there were no consequences. I was protecting Kevin." I said the old excuse, rising automatically. Ben shook his head. "You were protecting yourself from having to watch him get hurt. There is a difference." He took a long drink of his beer. "What happens when the explosion happens? Howard, because it is coming. The audit is 3 weeks away now." "Yes, and when the shrapnel starts flying, are you going to stand here in Lancaster and watch the smoke, or are you going to finally tell the kid the truth?" "I don't know," I whispered. Ben pointed a calloused finger at me. "Peace is not the absence of conflict, Howard. It is the ability to handle it. You don't have peace yet. You just have a pause button." 2 weeks later, the pause button popped back up. I was painting the front porch railing, enjoying the morning sun, when a black SUV turned onto my street. It wasn't a local truck. It was clean polished and aggressive. I knew the engine sound before I saw the driver. My stomach dropped. I carefully placed the paintbrush on the tray and wiped my hands on a rag. By the time I stood up, Kevin was parking at the curb. He looked terrible. My son had always been handsome in a soft, unthreatening way, but now his face was gray. He had lost weight. His shirt was wrinkled, which was unlike him. He stepped out of the car and stared at the house, at the patched roof, the half-painted railing, the weeds I hadn't gotten to yet. He looked like a man visiting a grave. "Dad," he said. "Hello, Kevin." I didn't invite him in. I stayed on the porch holding the high ground. It was an instinct I hadn't known I possessed. "Can I come up?" he asked. I nodded. He walked up the steps, avoiding the wet paint. He didn't hug me. He stood 3 feet away, wringing his hands. I noticed he was twisting his wedding band, a nervous tic he had developed in high school. "The place looks better," he said. "It is getting there." Kevin took a breath that shuddered in his chest. "Look, Dad, I didn't come here to talk about the house. I drove 2 hours because we need help." I waited. "The audit started last week," he said. His voice was tight, strung like a wire about to snap. "They are asking questions, a lot of questions." "What kind of questions?" "About expenses. Categories, things that don't match up. Lorraine she is really stressed, Dad. She hasn't slept in days. She told me to come down here and ask if you could maybe call the auditors, just to clarify things." I stared at him. The audacity was breathtaking. They had kicked me out, called me useless, and now they wanted me to clean up the mess one last time. She wants me to explain the books I asked. The books she said I was too simple to understand. Kevin flinched. "Dad, please, don't be like that. She didn't mean it. She's just under pressure. She says you probably mislabeled some things, because the system was old. If you just tell them it was a mistake, mislabeled." That was the narrative she was spinning. The old man got confused. The data entry clerk put the numbers in the wrong columns. "Kevin," I said, keeping my voice low, "I'm not calling the auditors. I do not work for you anymore, but I am the CEO. "Oh, Dad," he shouted, his composure cracking. "If they find something wrong, it is my name on the paperwork. I could get in trouble. Serious trouble. Then you should ask your wife why the numbers don't add up." I did. She says it is fine, but the auditors keep asking about vendors I've never heard of. I looked at him. This was it. The moment Ben had talked about. I could save him right now. I could lie. I could take the fall. I could say I was senile and confused and spared him the pain of knowing the woman he slept next to was a thief. Or I could let him grow up. I took a step closer to him. Kevin, I said, do you know a company called Strategic Consulting, LLC? The color drained from his face completely. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I watched his eyes. He knew the name. He had seen it on the bank statements he signed without reading. He had seen the mail. He knew deep down in the place where we hide the truths that would ruin our lives. I don't... That is your answer, isn't it? I said softly. You don't want to know. That is how you survive. Dad, stop. I put my hands on the railing, gripping the wood until my knuckles turned white. You came here asking for help, Kevin. But you need to answer one question before you drive back to Philadelphia. Do you want me to help you, or do you want me to help your wife? He stared at me, tears welling in his eyes. Is there a difference? He whispered. I looked at my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man who was now drowning in shallow water. Yes, I said. There is all the difference in the world. He stood there for a long minute. Then he turned around, walked down the steps, got into his expensive car, and drove away. He didn't look back. I didn't sleep that night. The house felt empty again despite the furniture Ben and I had dragged in. The encounter with Kevin had peeled back the scab I had spent 3 weeks trying to form. At 2 a.m, I was sitting up in bed, my laptop glowing in the dark. I wasn't looking at spreadsheets. I was looking at Diane's emails again. I scrolled to one from 4 years ago. Subject: The Shark. Howard. I saw it again today. The way she looks at the checkbook, the way she intercepts the mail before you get home. You think you're keeping the peace, but you are just feeding the alligator, hoping it eats you last. Protecting Kevin from the truth isn't love, Howard. It's fear, and fear is a terrible legacy to leave our son. She had been right. She was always right. I had mistaken cowardice for loyalty. I closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. The silence of the house pressed in on me. I felt the vibration of the phone on the nightstand before I heard the ring. It was late. Too late for a social call. I picked it up. It was a Philadelphia number, not Kevin's, not Lorraine's. I swiped to answer. Hello, Mr. Webb? The voice was female, crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a person who hunted for a living. This is Carol Nash, she said, from Ernst & Young. I am the lead auditor for Webb Food Distribution. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm in the quiet room. I'm sorry to call so late, she continued, not sounding sorry at all. But I have been reviewing the historical ledgers. Your name is listed as the preparer for the last 6 fiscal years. I gripped the phone. I have some questions, Mr. Webb, about a recurring vendor and about some manual adjustments that appear to mask significant outflows. She waited. I sat there in the dark in the house my father built with the evidence of my own crimes sitting in a box in the kitchen. Mr. Webb, she asked, are you there? The road of trials was over. The judgment had arrived. Mr. Webb. Are you there? The voice in my ear was polite, professional, and sharp as a scalpel. It was the voice of a woman who knew the answer before she asked the question. I sat on the edge of my mattress in the dark. My hand gripped the phone tight enough to make my knuckles ache. Through the window, the streetlight cast long skeletal shadows across the floorboards Ben and I had refinished. I am here, I said. My voice sounded rusty, like a door hinge that had not been used in years. Thank you for taking my call, Mrs. Nash said. I know it is late. I'm reviewing the vendor list for Webb Food Distribution. I have flagged a series of payments to a company called Strategic Consulting, LLC. I closed my eyes. There it was, the name I had spent 5 years staring at, the ghost in the machine. Mrs. Nash continued, the sound of typing clicking rhythmically in the background. I cannot find a tax ID number for this entity. There are no invoices attached to the payments, no contracts, no deliverables, just wire transfers totaling $580,000 over the last 5 years. She paused. The silence was heavy, expectant. She was waiting for me to explain. She was waiting for the former chief accountant of Fitzgerald Corp to offer a rational, business-based reason why $500,000 had vanished into thin air. I could end it right now. I could tell her everything. I could explain that Strategic Consulting, LLC, was a bank account registered to a P.O. box in Delaware that belonged to my daughter-in-law. I could tell her about the crypto wallet. I could burn the whole house down with a single sentence. But I didn't. I stayed silent. It was not loyalty that held my tongue. It was something darker. It was the morbid curiosity of a man watching a car crash in slow motion, waiting to see if the driver would swerve at the last second. "Mr. Webb," she pressed, "as the preparer of record for these years, do you have any documentation for this vendor?" I took a breath. The air in the room was cold. "I do not," I said. The typing stopped. "You do not recall the vendor, or you do not have the records." "I do not have the records," I said. "I entered the data I was given. I no longer work for the company. It was the first time I had actively lied to a peer." I felt a wave of nausea roll through my stomach. I was breaking the cardinal rule of my profession, the oath I had sworn when I got my CPA license 30 years ago. I was obfuscating. "I see," Mrs. Nash said. Her tone had shifted. The politeness was still there, but the warmth had evaporated. "It is very unusual for a sum this large to lack documentation, if this cannot be reconciled. Mr. Webb, I will have to flag it as a material weakness, or worse." She left the threat hanging in the air, or fraud. "If you remember anything, please call me," she said. "This is significant." I hung up the phone. I sat in the dark for a long time listening to the wind rattle the old window frames. I had just lied to protect the woman who called me useless, or maybe I had lied to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, it would fall on her alone without my fingerprints on the handle. 2 weeks passed. They were slow, quiet weeks. The panic from the phone call faded into a dull, thumping anxiety that lived in the back of my throat. I tried to distract myself with the house. Ben and I replaced the rotting wood on the back deck. We painted the shutters a deep slate blue. We drank beer in his garage and watched the Phillies lose on a small television perched on a stack of tires. I checked my phone constantly, waiting for the explosion, waiting for Kevin to call screaming, waiting for the police. But the phone stayed silent. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was weeding the front walk, it buzzed in my pocket. It was Kevin. I wiped my dirty hands on my jeans and answered. "Hello, Kevin." "Dad," he said. He sounded breathless, like he had just run a mile. "Dad, it is okay. What is okay?" "The audit," he said. The relief in his voice was so thick I could almost taste it. Lorraine handled it. She talked to the auditors. She had a long meeting with them yesterday. My grip on the phone tightened. Lorraine talked to Carol Nash, the shark against the barracuda. What did she say? Kevin, she explained everything he said. He was talking fast, eager to believe the nightmare was over. She told them it was a misunderstanding with the categorization. The payments to Strategic Consulting were for long-term brand development. She showed them some emails. She said the paperwork was just misfiled because our old system was so outdated. I closed my eyes. Brand development. It was a flimsy lie, a desperate lie. No auditor worth their salt would accept emails in place of invoices for $500,000, and they accepted that I asked. Well, they are still finalizing the report, Kevin said, but Lorraine says it is fine. She says they understood. She is negotiating with them now to close it out. Negotiating. You do not negotiate a fraud finding. You confess or you go to jail. Dad. Kevin continued, his voice dropping to a softer register. I just wanted to tell you. I know I came down there and I know things were tense. But it is going to be okay. Lorraine is fixing it. I looked at the weeds between the paving stones, dandelions. They looked fragile, but their roots went deep, choking everything else underground. I'm glad you feel better, Kevin, I said. Listen, he said, maybe in a few weeks when this is all over you could come up for dinner. The kids miss you. Jake keeps asking why you aren't there to check his math homework. The mention of Jake felt like a physical blow. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to drive up there right now and hug him. I wanted to believe just for a moment that Lorraine had actually pulled off a miracle, that she had charmed the auditors, fixed the books, and saved the family. I wanted the false victory to be real. We will see Kevin, I said. I hung up. Across the street, Ben was watering his lawn. He saw me standing there, phone in hand, and turned off the hose. He walked over, leaning against the fence. Good news, he asked, seeing the look on my face. Kevin says it is handled, I said. He says Lorraine explained it away as a filing error. Ben raised an eyebrow that had seen 68 years of human nonsense. "And you believe that I want to," I said. Ben snorted. He pulled a pack of gum from his pocket and offered me a piece. "Howard, you told me the woman stole $580,000. You do not explain that away as a filing error. That is not a missing receipt for a business lunch. That is a felony." "I know," I said. "She is stalling," Ben said. "She is buying time. And your son is buying the bridge she is selling him because he is terrified of the water." He was right. I knew he was right. But standing there in the sunlight with the smell of cut grass in the air, I let myself pretend for just a minute that the bullet had missed us. The bullet didn't miss. It just took 10 more days to travel the distance. It arrived at 11 o'clock at night on a rainy Friday. I was reading in the living room, listening to the rain drum against the new gutters we had installed. A car turned into the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the front window like searchlights. I knew who it was. I stood up and went to the door. Kevin was standing on the porch. He was soaked. He wasn't wearing a coat. He held a thick envelope in his hand, shielding it from the rain with his body. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. His eyes were wide and rimmed with red. His skin was the color of old paper. "Come in," I said. He walked past me into the kitchen. He didn't take off his wet shoes. He didn't seem to notice he was tracking mud onto the floor I had scrubbed yesterday. He walked to the table and dropped the envelope on it. It landed with a heavy, wet thud. "Read it," he whispered. I sat down. I opened the envelope. The letterhead was embossed, Ernst & Young. I skipped the pleasantries and went straight to the second paragraph. "Regarding the audit of financial statements for Webb Food Distribution for the fiscal year ending December 31st, we have identified material irregularities regarding payments to the vendor identified as Strategic Consulting, LLC. Total disbursements over the 5-year period amount to $580,342. Despite requests for documentation, management has failed to provide valid contracts, invoices, or tax identification numbers for this entity. Furthermore, the explanations provided regarding brand development are inconsistent with the nature of the business and lack evidentiary support." I turned the page. My finger traced the lines I had known were coming. "Therefore, we are unable to issue an unqualified opinion on the financial statements. Unless satisfactory documentation is provided within 30 days, we will be forced to issue a qualified opinion citing limitation of scope and potential material misstatement due to fraud. We are also obligated under professional standards to report potential illegal acts to the appropriate governance bodies. 30 days. A qualified opinion. In the corporate world, that was a death sentence. It meant the numbers couldn't be trusted. The bank would see it and call the loans immediately. Vendors would stop shipping on credit. The company would be insolvent in a month. And the line about reporting potential illegal acts. That was the polite way of saying they were calling the IRS and the district attorney. I looked up at Kevin. He was shaking. Not from the cold, but from a terror so deep it was vibrating his bones. "Lorraine said she fixed it," he said. His voice was a broken croak. "She told me 2 weeks ago she fixed it. She lied to me, Dad." I put the letter down. "She lied to you about a lot of things, Kevin." He pulled a chair out and collapsed into it. He put his head in his hands. She says she can still explain it. She says if we just get the right paperwork. She asked me to sign some things, backdated contracts." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "I didn't sign them, Dad. I didn't. But she is screaming at me. She says I'm letting the family down. She says I'm weak." He took a jagged breath. "But Dad, you did the books. For 5 years, you were there every day." The question hung in the air. The question he hadn't asked 3 weeks ago. The question he was finally desperate enough to voice. "How did you miss $500,000? I looked at my son. I looked at the rain streaming down the black glass of the window. The time for protection was over. The time for silence was dead. I didn't miss it, Kevin. The room went absolutely still. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. What he whispered. "I didn't miss it," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I found the first payment 5 years ago, $7,000, then $12,000. I tracked every single cent. I knew exactly where it was going." Kevin stared at me, his face crumpled in slow-motion confusion, warring with betrayal. You knew she was stealing." "Yes, and you didn't tell me no." "Wow. he screamed. The sound tore out of his throat, raw and agonizing. Why did you let her do this to us? Why didn't you stop her? Because I was a coward, I said. I stood up. I needed to stand. I needed him to see me not as his father, the hero, but as the flawed, broken man I was. I hid it because I didn't want you to have to choose between your wife and the truth. I hid it because I thought I could fix it from the shadows. I thought if I balanced the books, I could balance your marriage. I was wrong. Kevin stood up too. He backed away from me, knocking the chair over. It clattered loudly on the floor. You lied to me every day, he said. You ate dinner at my table. You played with my children, and you watched her rob me, and you said nothing. I was trying to save you, I said. Save me. He laughed, a hysterical, wet sound. You didn't save me, Dad. You let me drown. You and Lorraine. You are the same. You both think I'm too stupid to handle the truth. That hit me harder than any slap. You have 30 days, Kevin, I said softly. He looked at the letter on the table. Then he looked at me with a gaze that was entirely devoid of love. I don't have 30 days, he said. I have nothing. He turned and walked out the door. He didn't close it. The rain blew into the kitchen, soaking the floor, soaking the letter from Ernst & Young, soaking the wreckage of everything I had tried to protect. I watched his taillights fade into the darkness. The middle of the story had arrived, and nobody had won. The silence that followed Kevin's departure was not peaceful. It was heavy, charged with the static electricity of a coming storm. For 5 days, I did not leave the house. I sat in the living room chair watching the street, waiting for the fallout. I jumped every time the phone rang. I flinched every time a car door slammed. I was a man waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing it was going to be a steel-toed boot. On the 5th afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. It was not Kevin's SUV. It was a black sedan, sleek and predatory, the kind of car that looked out of place on my cracked concrete driveway. I stood up. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew who it was before the door opened. Lorraine. She stepped out. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than the renovations Ben and I had done in the kitchen. She scanned the house, the peeling paint on the neighbor's fence, the overgrown oak tree with a look of clinical detachment. She was assessing the weakness of the fortress. She didn't knock. She walked right in through the front door I had unlocked earlier that morning. She stood in my living room, her presence sucking the oxygen out of the space. She looked at the second-hand sofa, the small television, and finally, at me. Howard, she said. She did not call me Dad. That title had been revoked. Lorraine, I said. She placed her designer bag on the coffee table, creating a barrier between us. She didn't sit. She paced her heels, clicking on the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down time. Kevin told me, she said. Her voice was calm. Terrifyingly calm. He told me that you claim to have known about the transfers for 5 years. I have the records, Lorraine. Every dollar. She stopped pacing and turned to face me. A cold smile played on her lips. I believe you, she said. And that is exactly the problem, Howard. Not for me, for you. I frowned. I had expected denial. I had expected screaming. I had not expected this cool, calculated pivot. I am not the one who stole $500,000, I said. No? She agreed. You are just the licensed CPA who found the theft, documented it, and then spent 5 years actively concealing it from the shareholders and the IRS. My stomach dropped. You know the law better than I do. Howard, she continued, stepping closer, you have a fiduciary duty. By adjusting the inventory logs to mask the cash flow issues, by signing off on the internal reconciliation reports, you didn't just watch a crime happen, you participated in it. I did it to protect the company, I said. But the words sounded weak even to my own ears. She laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. You can tell that to a judge. In the eyes of the law, that is called aiding and abetting. It is called obstruction. It is conspiracy to commit fraud. She leaned in, her perfume thick and expensive, filling my nostrils. If I go down, Howard, I am taking you with me. And I will make sure the narrative is very clear. I was an inexperienced business owner who made mistakes. You were the veteran chief accountant who manipulated the books to cover your own incompetence. You are threatening me, I said. I am stating facts, she countered. She walked back to her bag and pulled out a folder. She tossed it onto the table next to my stack of magazines. Here is the situation. The auditors want an explanation for the missing documentation. You are going to give it to them. I stared at the folder. What do you want me to do? You're going to write a letter, she said. You are going to state that due to the outdated legacy software and your own declining cognitive faculties, you mislabeled the vendor payments. You confused the consulting fees with the inventory purchases. It was a clerical error, a senior moment. She wanted me to play the fool. She wanted the man who had managed billion-dollar mergers to admit to being senile. And if I refuse, she picked up her bag, sliding the strap over her shoulder. Then I will tell everyone that we were partners. I will tell them you took a cut. I will bury you in legal fees so deep you will lose this little house and everything else you own. I have the company lawyers on retainer, Howard. You have a checking account and a friend who fixes cars. Do the math. She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. You have 3 days to send that letter to Carol Nash. Do it for Kevin. He really does not want to see his father in prison. She left. The door clicked shut. The house was silent again, but now it felt like a cage. 3 days passed. I did not write the letter. I sat in the kitchen, paralyzed, watching the sun move across the linoleum floor. I kept waiting for Kevin. Surely once the initial shock wore off, he would see through her. He would remember who I was. He would remember the pizza analogies and the nights I stayed up helping him with his science projects. He would realize that his wife was holding a gun to his father's head. On the third evening, the phone rang. It was Kevin. I answered it on the first ring. Kevin. Dad, he said. His voice sounded thin, stretched to the breaking point, like a wire vibrating in the wind. Kevin, listen to me, I started. She was here. She threatened me. She wants me to lie to the auditors. I know, he said. The 2 words stopped me cold. You know, I talked to her dad. I talked to the lawyers. Look, it is complicated. It is not complicated, Kevin. She stole money. She made bad investments. He corrected me. He was using her words now. I could hear her cadence in his voice. She was trying to fix things. And you have to admit, Dad, you made mistakes too. You shouldn't have hidden it. If you had just told us. So is it my fault? I asked, my voice trembling. No one is saying it is your fault, he said, sounding exhausted. We just want peace, Dad. We want this to be over. The lawyer says, if you just cooperate, if you just sign the statement, everyone walks away. The company survives. The family survives. I gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. Kevin, do you understand what you are asking me to do? You are asking me to destroy my reputation. You are asking me to commit perjury to save the woman who robbed you. I'm asking you to save us, he whispered. I closed my eyes. I saw him as a boy, scraping his knee and looking up at me to fix it. I'd spent his entire life fixing it. I'd smoothed the road, cushioned the falls, paid the debts. And now he was asking me to lie down in the road so she could drive over me just so he wouldn't have to feel the bumps. I cannot do it, Kevin. Dad, please. I cannot do it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then you are leaving us no choice, he said. His voice was cold now, detached. It was the voice of a man who had made his decision and was trying to kill his conscience to live with it. Kevin, goodbye, Dad. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone until the screen went dark. He had chosen. He had chosen the lie because the truth was too painful. He had chosen her. And I was alone. The final blow arrived 1 week later. It came by certified mail. The mail carrier, a cheerful woman named Betty, who usually waved, looked solemn when she handed me the thick envelope. She asked for a signature. My hand shook as I signed the green card. I took the envelope into the kitchen. I didn't open it immediately. I made a cup of coffee. I stared at the return address, Schwartz Miller and Vance Attorneys at Law. I used a butter knife to slit the top. The letter inside was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper. The language was precise, formal, and devastating. Dear Mr. Webb, we represent Mrs. Lorraine Webb and Webb Food Distribution. We have been informed of your admission regarding the maintenance of fraudulent financial records between the years of 2018 and 2024. As a certified public accountant, your actions constitute a gross violation of professional standards and fiduciary responsibility. You knowingly prepared materially false statements. You engaged in a multi-year scheme to obscure the true financial position of the company. I had to put the paper down. My hands were shaking too badly to hold it. We are prepared to file formal complaints with the Pennsylvania State Board of Accountancy to revoke your license. Furthermore, we are compiling evidence to submit to the FBI Financial Crimes Division regarding your role as the primary architect of this financial mismanagement. We hereby offer one final opportunity for you to provide a sworn statement clarifying that these discrepancies were the result of unintentional clerical errors on your part. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in immediate legal action. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper blurring in front of my eyes. The primary architect. They were pinning it all on me, all of it. The $580,000, the tax evasion, bank fraud. Lorraine wasn't just going to let me take the fall. She was going to paint me as the villain, and she had the documentation to prove it. My user ID was on every entry. My signature was on every reconciliation. I looked around the small, empty kitchen. I was 71 years old. I had a checking account with $12,000 in it. I had a house that was half renovated. I was going to prison. The realization hit me with the physical force of a punch to the gut. I would die in a cell. Jake would grow up thinking his grandfather was a thief. Kevin would live the rest of his life under Lorraine's thumb, believing he had done the right thing by cutting out the cancer. I put my head in my hands. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thin, insufficient. Diane, I thought. I'm so sorry. I tried. I really tried. The whiff of death. That is what they call it in stories, the moment where the hero realizes he is lost. But I wasn't a hero. I was just an old accountant who had loved his son too much and himself too little. I sat there for an hour watching the dusk settle over the yard, turning the vibrant green grass to gray. My phone rang. I didn't want to answer it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I let it ring 3 times, 4 times. Then I looked at the caller ID. Ben. I picked it up. Hello, Ben, Howard Ben said. His voice was urgent, devoid of his usual gruff humor. I saw the mail truck. I saw the certified envelope. Is it bad? It is the end, Ben, I said softly. They are going to report me to the FBI. They are going to frame me for everything. There was silence on the line. Then Ben spoke, his voice hard as iron. Don't you dare give up Howard. Do not let that woman win. I don't have a choice, Ben. They have lawyers. They have money. I have nothing. You have the truth, Ben said. And you have me. Listen to me, my wife. Before she passed, we dealt with a mess involving her brother's estate. We hired a guy, a criminal defense attorney here in Lancaster. I laughed, a weak, brittle sound. I cannot afford a criminal defense attorney. He owes me a favor, Ben said. A big one. I fixed his GTO when every other mechanic in the state said it was scrap metal. His name is Martin Shaw. Martin Shaw, I repeated. The name meant nothing to me. He is expecting your call, Ben said. I told him everything. He says if you have the records you say you have. Then Lorraine just made the biggest mistake of her life. What mistake? She poked the bear, Howard. Call him, now. I looked at the phone. I looked at the threatening letter on the table. For 5 years I had been the silent accountant. I had been the rug they swept their dirt under. I picked up the pen I had used to sign for the certified mail. I wrote down the number Ben gave me. I took a deep breath. I dialed. The office of Martin Shaw smelled of lemon polish and old leather. It was located in a converted row house on Duke Street, a few blocks from the county courthouse. There were no glass walls or chrome fixtures here, just floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with case law binders that looked like they had been touched every day for 40 years. I sat in a wing-back chair that was slightly too comfortable, my hands resting on my knees to keep them from trembling. Ben sat next to me, turning his eagle's cap over and over in his grease-stained hands. Across the mahogany desk, Martin Shaw studied the stack of papers I had printed out. He was a man of about 62, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and eyes that seemed to have seen every variety of human foolishness. He didn't look like a shark. He looked like a grandfather who happened to know how to dismantle a bomb. He turned the last page of my summary, then took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Webb," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, calm and unhurried. "Let me be blunt. You have a problem. I know I said. Lorraine is going to report me. That is not the problem," Martin corrected. "The problem is that she is right." The air left the room. Ben stopped fidgeting with his hat. I leaned forward, but I didn't steal the money. "No," Martin said. "You just held the flashlight while she robbed the safe." He tapped the stack of papers. "You discovered fraud in year 2. You concealed it for 5 years. But you didn't just hide it, Howard. You adjusted the inventory valuations. You manipulated the depreciation schedules. You created false journal entries to balance the accounts. That is not passive observation. That is active participation. In the eyes of the law, that is aiding and abetting. It is conspiracy to commit tax fraud. He looked at me with a pity that felt heavier than judgment. If this goes to trial, and Lorraine testifies that she was just an inexperienced owner, relying on her veteran accountant father-in-law, a jury might believe her. You have the skills, you have the access, and you have the signature on every single reconciliation. I felt cold despite the warmth of the office. So I am guilty, I whispered. Technically, yes, Martin said. And at your age, a federal prison sentence of even 2 years is significant. Ben slammed his hand on the armrest of his chair. This is bull, Ben growled. He did it to protect his kid. He didn't take a dime. Motive matters for sentencing, Ben, but not for the verdict, Martin said gently. He looked back at me. So here are your options. Option 1 is we wait. We hope Lorraine is bluffing, but based on the letter you showed me, she is not bluffing. She has nothing to lose. If she goes down, she is taking you with her to dilute the blame. And option 2, I asked. Martin leaned back in his chair. Option 2 is a proffer agreement. I frowned. I had heard the term on television procedurals, but I didn't truly understand the mechanics. We go to the FBI Financial Crimes Division, Martin explained. We go to them first. Before Lorraine files her complaint, we offer a voluntary disclosure. You walk in there, you sit down with an assistant U.S. attorney, and you tell them everything. The theft, the cover-up, the crypto wallet, the shell company. And they let me go. I asked, a spark of hope flaring in my chest. Martin held up a hand. Slow down. This is not the movies. Prosecutors do not just hand out immunity like candy. A proffer agreement means that what you say in that room cannot be used against you provided you do not lie. But it does not guarantee they won't prosecute you based on other evidence. You have to prove that your value as a witness against the primary target, Lorraine, is greater than your liability as an accomplice. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. You are rolling the dice, Howard. If the prosecutor decides you are the big fish, or if they think you are holding back, you could be handing them the confession they need to put you away. I looked at the USB drive sitting on his desk. 5 years of my life. 5 years of silence. So I could still go to prison, I said. Yes, Martin said. Either way, you risk prison. The difference is that on one path you continue to live a lie until it crushes you. On the other path, you tell the truth and take your chances. The room was silent. I could hear the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. I need to think, I said. Martin nodded. Take the night, but Howard. Do not take too long. In a race to the prosecutor's office, there is no prize for second place. I didn't sleep that night. The house in Lancaster was quiet, but my mind was a cacophony of fear and regret. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the screen casting a ghostly glow on the walls. I kept thinking about what Martin had said. You held the flashlight. I had told myself I was a martyr. I had convinced myself that I was the noble father sacrificing his integrity to save his son's happiness. But sitting there in the dark, stripped of my excuses, I saw the ugly truth. I hadn't been protecting Kevin. I had been controlling him. By hiding the truth, I had denied him the right to know who he was married to. I had treated him like a child who couldn't handle the dark, so I kept the lights off even as the monster ate us alive. I opened my email archives. I needed to see her face. I needed to see Diane. I scrolled through the photos, the old messages, and then I went to the drafts folder. Diane had a habit of writing emails when she couldn't sleep, venting her worries to the screen and then saving them instead of sending them. She used to say that writing it down took the power out of fear. I found one dated 3 weeks before she died. The subject line was blank. Howard, I am writing this because I am too cowardly to say it to your face. I know what you are doing with the books. I see how tired you look when you come home from their house. You think you are being a good father. You think you are keeping the peace. But you are building a prison, Howard, and you are calling it a home. I know you are doing it because you love Kevin, but protecting him from the truth isn't love. It is fear. You're afraid that if he knows the truth, he will break, but he is stronger than you think. And if you keep treating him like he is fragile, he will never learn how to be strong. Letting go is not abandonment, my love. Sometimes letting go is the highest form of love. It means you trust them enough to survive the fall. If I'm gone when you read this, please forgive yourself. But do not forgive yourself too easily. Use the guilt to do better. Love, D. I stared at the screen until the words blurred into gray smudges. Tears ran down my face, hot and fast. I hadn't cried since the funeral. I hadn't let myself. Accountants don't cry. They reconcile. But there was no reconciling this. She had known. She had predicted this moment 5 years ago. I had built a prison of lies, locked myself and Kevin inside, and handed the key to Lorraine. Letting go is the highest form of love. I wiped my face with my sleeve. I looked at the dark window where my reflection stared back, a tired gray man who had spent a lifetime trying to control the uncontrollable. I was done controlling. The sun was just starting to bleed gray light into the sky when I drove back to Martin Shaw's office. I sat in his parking lot until I saw his Buick pull in at 7:30. He looked surprised to see me waiting by the door. "Mr. Webb?" He said, "Unlock the office. You are an early riser." "I didn't sleep," I said. We walked into the office. The smell of lemon polish was comforting this time. Familiar. "I want the proffer agreement," I said, before I even sat down. Martin put his briefcase on the desk and looked at me carefully. "You understand the risk?" "I understand. I could lose everything, but I'm done lying." Martin studied my face for a long moment. Then he nodded a sharp, decisive motion. "All right, I will make the call. The FBI Financial Crimes Squad in Philadelphia has jurisdiction. We can probably get a meeting within 48 hours. He reached for his phone, but I held up a hand. "I have one condition, Martin." He paused, his hand hovering over the receiver. "You're not really in a position to set conditions." "Howard, this is not a legal condition," I said. "It is a personal one. I want to call Kevin." Martin frowned. "Howard, that is dangerous. If you tell him, he tells Lorraine. If she knows you are going to the feds, she might destroy evidence. She might file her complaint first. You could lose your leverage." "I know," I said. "Then why do it?" "Because he is my son," I said, "and because I owe him the truth. I spent 5 years treating him like he couldn't handle reality. I'm not going to do that anymore. If I go behind his back to the FBI, I am just continuing the cycle. I'm going to tell him what I'm doing. I'm going to give him the dignity of knowing what is coming." Martin tapped his fingers on the desk. He looked at the law books on his shelves, then back at me. "It is a bad strategy," he said. "It is good fatherhood," I replied. Martin sighed a long exhale that sounded like a tire deflating. "Okay," he said. "But make it fast, and do not let him talk you out of it." I took my phone out of my pocket. My hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped. I dialed the number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" Kevin's voice sounded groggy, confused. It was early. "Kevin," I said. "Dad?" He hesitated. "Dad, I told you. Unless you're calling to say you signed the letter, I cannot talk to you. Lorraine is—" "I'm not signing the letter, Kevin." I heard him sigh, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Then why are you calling? To yell at me again?" "No," I said. "I'm calling to tell you the truth." I stood up and walked to the window of the office. Outside, the town of Lancaster was waking up. People were walking to work. Cars were stopping at red lights. Life was moving forward, indifferent to my disaster. "I'm going to the FBI, Kevin." There was a silence on the other end of the line, so profound I thought the call had dropped. What he whispered. "I have a lawyer." "We are meeting with the Financial Crimes Division. I am turning over all the records, the USB drive, the backups, everything. Dad, you can't. I am, but Lorraine said you would go to prison. She said you are an accomplice. I might go to prison," I said. "I'm willing to accept that. I cooked the books, Kevin. I broke the law. I'm going to own that." "But why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you do that to yourself?" "Why would you do that to us? Because it is the only way to free you," I said. "Free me from what?" "From the lie." "Kevin, Dad, please," he begged. "Just sign the letter. Just make it go away. It is not going away, son. It never was. I'm going to tell them everything about strategic consulting, about the crypto wallet, about how I covered it up, and I'm going to tell them that you knew nothing." I gripped the phone tight. "I'm doing this to protect you, Kevin. But this time, I'm protecting you with the truth, not a lie. Dad." "Don't I love you, Kevin?" I said. I hung up. I turned back to Martin. He was watching me with an expression that looked like respect. "It is done," I said. Martin picked up his phone receiver. "Then, let's go to Philadelphia." The conference room at the FBI field office in Philadelphia was windowless and cold. It smelled of stale coffee and aggressive air conditioning. I sat on one side of a long laminate table, my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from shaking. Martin sat to my right, his briefcase open, looking as relaxed as if he were sitting on his front porch. Across from us sat Special Agent Morrison, a woman with eyes like flint, and Assistant United States Attorney Vance, a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since the Reagan administration. A small digital recorder sat in the center of the table. Its red light was a tiny, unblinking eye. Mr. Webb, Agent Morrison said, "You understand that this is a proffer session. Anything you say here cannot be used against you in a direct case in chief provided you are truthful. However, if you lie, or if we find evidence from independent sources, this agreement does not protect you." "I understand," I said. "Then, let us begin. Tell us about Strategic Consulting, LLC. I took a breath. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times, usually in nightmares, where I was wearing an orange jumpsuit. But now that it was here, a strange calm settled over me. It was just data. It was just a reconciliation of the truth. I opened my folder. I first noticed the discrepancy 5 years ago, a wire transfer of $7,000. It lacked a corresponding invoice. I traced it to a bank account in Delaware. Over the next 60 months, the payments escalated. Total disbursements equaled $580,342.67. Attorney Vance leaned forward. "And you did not report this number. Why?" "Because the account belonged to my daughter-in-law, Lorraine Webb." I walked them through the timeline. I explained the crypto wallet I had traced the funds to. I explained how she had lost the initial sum and then doubled down, stealing more to try and win it back. Then came the hard part. I explained what I had done. I told them how I adjusted the inventory depreciation schedules to hide the cash flow gaps. I told them how I manipulated the quarterly reports so the bank covenants wouldn't trigger a default. I admitted to every keystroke, every false entry, every lie I had woven into the ledger to keep my son's world from collapsing. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy. Agent Morrison picked up the stack of documents I had provided. She flipped through them, her eyebrows knitting together. "These records," she said, "they are incredibly detailed. You documented the fraud better than the fraudster did." "I am an accountant," I said. "We keep records." Attorney Vance looked at me over his glasses. "Mr. Webb, you are admitting to aiding and abetting a federal crime. You facilitated wire fraud. You cooked the books for 5 years. Why should we give you immunity?" Martin leaned forward. "Because he is the best witness you have. He has the map. He knows where everybody is buried because he is the one who dug the graves, and he came forward voluntarily." Vance tapped his pen on the table. "He helped dig the graves, counselor." "But he didn't put the bodies in them," Martin countered. "And he didn't take a dime. Look at his bank statements. He lives on Social Security and a pension. He drove here in a 10-year-old Honda. There was no financial gain." Vance looked at me. "Why did you do it, Mr. Webb?" I looked him in the eye. "Because I thought I was saving my son. I was wrong." Vance stared at me for a long moment. He didn't blink. He didn't nod. He just closed his folder. "We will take this under advisement," he said. "We will be in touch." We walked out of the federal building and into the bright, noisy Philadelphia afternoon. I felt lightheaded, as if I had just donated a pint of blood. "Now we wait," Martin said. The waiting was a physical wait. I went back to Lancaster. I painted the trim on the bungalow. I mowed the lawn until it looked like a putting green. Ben came over every night bringing pizza and distraction, but neither of us talked about the phone that sat silently on the kitchen table. 2 weeks passed. Then, on a Tuesday night, headlights swept across my living room window. It was 9 o'clock. I went to the door. Kevin was standing on the porch. He looked older. The boyish softness I had always associated with him was gone, replaced by new lines around his mouth and eyes. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, looking like the version of himself that used to help me rake leaves. "Dad," he said. "Kevin." He hesitated, shifting his weight. "Can I come in?" I stepped back. He walked into the kitchen, the room where our relationship had shattered weeks ago. He stood by the table, running his hand along the back of a chair. "The FBI contacted Lorraine," he said. My stomach tightened. And they raided the office yesterday. They took her laptop. They took the servers. He looked up at me. His eyes were clear, no longer clouded by denial. She knows you talked, Dad. She knows you gave them everything. I nodded. Is she angry? She is terrified, Kevin said. She tried to get me to talk to her lawyer. She wanted me to say that you were senile, that you acted alone. She wanted me to say that I knew nothing and that you were the one controlling the accounts. And what did you do? I asked. Kevin pulled a chair out and sat down. I went to the FBI field office this morning, he said. I froze. You what? I gave a statement, Dad. I told them the truth. I sat down opposite him. What truth, Kevin? I told them I didn't know about the fraud. But I also told them that I didn't know because I chose not to look. I told them that Lorraine handled the finances and that I signed whatever she put in front of me. He took a breath. And I told them that you never took a cent. I told them you lived in our spare room and drove an old car and bought your own groceries. I told them that if you hid the money, it wasn't because you were a thief, it was because you were a father. Tears pricked my eyes. I blinked them back. You shouldn't have done that, Kevin. You should have stayed out of it. You could have implicated yourself. I am done staying out of it, he said. His voice was steady. I spent 45 years letting you and Lorraine drive the car. It is time I took the wheel. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His grip was strong. Lorraine's lawyer offered me a deal, he said. If I backed her story against you, she would give me full custody of the kids in the divorce. Divorce, I whispered. Kevin nodded. I filed yesterday, and I told her lawyer to go to hell. I'm not trading my father for a plea deal. We sat there in silence for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. It was the sound of a bomb that had finally stopped ticking. The call from Martin came 3 days later. I was in the garden planting tomatoes. I wiped the dirt from my hands and answered. Howard, Martin said. I just got off the phone with Vance. I held my breath. I looked at the blue sky. I looked at Ben's house across the street. I tried to memorize the way the sun hit the maple tree just in case I wouldn't see it for a few years. Tell me, I said. They accepted the records, Martin said. Your documentation was bulletproof. It corroborated the bank traces perfectly. Lorraine's lawyer tried to argue that you were the mastermind, that you set her up. And then Vance pulled out the letter. The letter, the one you wrote to Kevin, Martin said. The one you hid in the photo album. The FBI found it when they searched your effects during the vetting process. To Kevin. Open only in case of emergency. I had forgotten about it. I had written it the night I left Philadelphia, a final confession, tucked away in a box of memories. Vance read it. Martin continued. It detailed everything. The date, the amounts, the reason you were hiding it. It proved mens rea Howard. It proved your state of mind. You weren't acting for profit. You weren't acting with malice. You were acting under extreme emotional duress to protect a family member. It destroyed Lorraine's defense that you were the architect. I sank onto the porch steps. So what does that mean? It means they are offering a non-prosecution agreement, Martin said. You are clear, Howard. No charges, no prison. I let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 5 years. And Lorraine, she is pleading guilty, Martin said. Tax evasion and wire fraud. She is looking at 18 months, probably served 10 with good behavior. She has agreed to full restitution as part of the plea. I closed my eyes. It was over, Howard Martin said. You still have to testify at the sentencing. I will be there, I said. 2 months later, the summer heat had settled over Lancaster. The tomatoes I had planted were heavy and red on the vine. Kevin parked his car in the driveway. He got out looking tired but lighter somehow. He walked up the porch steps and sat in the rocking chair next to me. She was sentenced today, he said. I nodded. I knew. I had been there in the back of the courtroom. I had seen Lorraine in her orange jumpsuit stripped of her expensive armor. She hadn't looked at me. 18 months, Kevin said. She goes in next week. How are the kids? They are okay. Confused. But okay. Jake misses you. I miss him too. Kevin looked out at the street. A group of kids rode by on bicycles, their laughter trailing in the humid air. I sold the company, Dad. I looked at him. You did pending sale. To a competitor. It is enough to pay back the restitution and have a little left over. I'm going to start something new, something smaller, maybe landscaping. I like being outside. That sounds good, Kevin. He turned to look at me. I am seeing a therapist, he said. We are talking about patterns, about why I pick people who control me, about why I let silence do the heavy lifting in my relationships. I nodded. That is good work. Hard work. I learned it from you, Dad, he said softly. The silence. But I am unlearning it, and I think you are too. He stood up and put a hand on my shoulder. Bring Jake down this weekend, I said. The fishing is good at the creek. I will, he said. 5:17 in the morning. I woke up before the alarm. It was a habit my body refused to break, a muscle memory from 40 years of anxiety. I walked into the kitchen. The house was cool and quiet. But this morning there was no laptop on the table. There were no spreadsheets waiting to be balanced. There were no secrets hiding in the dark. I made a cup of coffee and walked out onto the back porch. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and burning gold. Across the street, I saw the light go on in Ben's kitchen. He was up early too. I sat on the step. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted rich and clean. The back door creaked open behind me. Small, bare feet padded across the wood. Grandpa. I turned. Jake was standing there rubbing sleep from his eyes. His hair was a bird's nest of tangles. He was wearing an oversized t-shirt Kevin had packed for him. Hey, buddy, I said. Why are you up? I couldn't sleep, he said. He came and sat next to me, leaning his head against my arm. The house is too quiet. It is just peaceful, Jake. Listen. We sat there for a moment. A mourning dove cooed from the telephone wire. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree. Do you have any math problems for me? He asked. I smiled. Not today. Today we are just watching the sun come up. He looked at the horizon. Mom is going away for a while, isn't she? Yes, she is. Dad says it is because she made mistakes. We all make mistakes, Jake. The important thing is what we do after we make them. He thought about that. Dad says you are a hero. He says you saved us. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. I am not a hero, Jake. I'm just a grandfather and an accountant, he giggled. That is boring. I laughed, a genuine sound that rose up from my belly and scared a squirrel off the fence. Yes, it is, I said. It is beautifully boring. The sun broke free of the horizon, flooding the yard with light. It illuminated the garden I had planted, the fence I had fixed, the life I had rebuilt from the ashes of my silence. Diane was right. Letting go hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. I took a deep breath of the morning air. I was Howard Webb. I was 71 years old. I had a checking account with $12,000, a house that needed a new water heater, and a grandson who was learning to love numbers. And for the first time in a very long time, the books were balanced. We often mistake silence for loyalty. We convince ourselves that by swallowing the hard truths and fixing problems from the shadows, we are protecting the people we love from pain. But Howard's journey teaches us a critical, often painful lesson. Shielding capable adults from the consequences of their reality is not protection. It is a form of control that eventually suffocates everyone involved. When you constantly fix the road for someone else, you rob them of the chance to learn how to drive. Howard had to learn that his value wasn't tied to his utility, and that real peace only comes when the ledger of truth is finally balanced, no matter the cost. Now take a moment to look at your own life. Is there a burden you are carrying in secret because you are afraid the people around you aren't strong enough to handle the weight? Are you setting yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm, waiting for a thank you that might never come? It is a terrifying thing to stop enabling and start empowering. But as Howard found it, is the only path to freedom. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever had to let someone you love fail so they could finally learn to stand on their own? We would love to hear your story.